So this afternoon, I really want to sort of lay out a story. And this is a story about a world that's really changing. Human activity over the last century has reshaped our planet, and it's altered landscapes. It probably has changed the world in ways that we haven't even imagined yet. And this has happened incredibly quickly. We've developed sophisticated systems of moving goods, products, and people around the globe at speeds that we've never seen before in human history. The problem that I'm going to underscore in this talk is that that same system, this global transportation infrastructure, also is open to stowaways. It's capable of moving pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites, invasive microbes, in ways that we also have never seen before in human history. And while our transportation routes have grown rapidly, our ability to control emerging new pathogens has not. Global capitalism is the dominant economic system in the world, and I'm not here to espouse socialism or some other system. I'm just stating that that is what we've got. This is the system that's in place. And under capitalism, there's great incentive to devise faster, cheaper ways to move more and more stuff to every corner of the earth. But under capitalism, there's little incentive to find a cure for some obscure disease that occasionally jumps over from camels to human beings in the Arabian Peninsula, or to devise a vaccine against a virus that only ever seems to kill people in the most remote parts of the Congo. So economics is driving a development of one system, a global transportation system. And that system could end up being the delivery mechanism for the next great plague. So while the titans of industry are pouring billions of dollars into how they're going to get more smartphones and selfie sticks and appliances to people all over the earth, researchers trying to figure out how to stop pathogens from spreading to every corner of the earth are left to beg for funds primarily from foundations, charities, and shrinking government coffers. And this is the great conundrum in global health in the 21st century. Powerful forces are bringing amazing economic benefit to people all around the world. And also, those same forces are making the world less safe from infectious disease. Throughout history, there have been outbreaks, plagues, epidemics, pandemics, and without a doubt, our world will encounter more of them in the years to come. And the big question is whether our world will be able to handle them. And I would argue that our recent encounters with HIV, Ebola, MERS, and SARS show that we will probably not handle them very well. In 1918, the Spanish flu killed an estimated 40 to 50 million people around the globe. At that time, there were less than 2 billion people on the planet. A century later, there's more than 7 billion people on Earth now. Particularly in low and middle-income countries, people are now being packed into megacities with 8, 10, 20 million people. These are the countries least prepared to combat a pandemic, yet they have the crowded conditions and often the poor sanitation infrastructure that could make them the tinderboxes for the next global pandemic. And it won't just be the impoverished developing countries that struggle. For the last 5 years, a mysterious ailment called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, has been striking and killing people in Saudi Arabia. And while there have been cases in other Middle Eastern countries, this epidemic is primarily in Saudi Arabia. Almost all of the cases have been in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is where we're seeing ongoing cases on a regular basis. And because my editor is not standing right behind me and being able to tell me that this is not a proven fact, this disease is coming from camels. And they haven't been able to prove that definitively yet, but it's quite clear that this is coming from camels. And the virus jumps over from camels to humans, and then somehow, once it gets into a hospital, the virus goes wild in the wards. Most MERS infections are contracted in Saudi hospitals. These are modern Western-style facilities, the type of place you would expect to be able to stop transmission of disease. And there's only been roughly 1,000 MERS cases since it was first identified. But in global health circles, researchers are extremely concerned about it, in part because of what's about to happen later this month in Saudi Arabia, the Hajj. This pilgrimage will bring in hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. And significantly for what I'm talking about tonight, all of them will then go home. And particularly when you've got a virus spreading in this environment, the question is whether MERS will come into people during the Hajj and then return to West Africa, to Indonesia, to Europe, and to the United States. And the question is whether they will bring MERS back with them and into an environment, to a healthcare system that doesn't know how to handle it. And this isn't just a theoretical question. In May of this year, a Korean businessman flew from the Middle East back to Seoul. And a few days later, he got sick. He ended up going to several hospitals seeking medical care. This one man ended up sparking an outbreak in Korea in which 186 people were infected, 36 people died, and probably more importantly, it caused a panic in the country. It shut down schools, it shut down hospitals, sent the Korean stock market tumbling. And it's important to remember that in the scale of outbreaks, this wasn't such a huge crisis. It was, 36 lives, but this was a fairly small outbreak compared to something like the Spanish flu. The Korean MERS outbreak illustrates that modern transmission routes that have developed are capable of moving these types of emerging infectious diseases to any corner of the world. When I look at these types of diseases, it strikes me that basically the world of late has been lucky. Aside from HIV, which I will get to in a moment, so far, the emerging infectious diseases that have been emerging just happen to lack the characteristics needed to cause a global pandemic. MERS only seems to spread in places where people have direct contact with patients who are already extremely sick. Maybe it lingers in the bed rails or the doors or the knobs of the hospitals. And researchers still don't know what exactly the transmission route is, but it's clear that the MERS virus doesn't simply fly through the air. There's no reason, however, that the next emerging virus won't be airborne. Let's think for a minute as if we were viruses, and we're just not going to be just any old viruses. We want to be highly ambitious viruses, and we want to take over the world. And our goal is not just survival, but world domination. And the thing is, why not? As different viruses come and mutate, eventually some virus will come along that meets the characteristics that I'm talking about. So as viruses, we want to be able to reproduce quickly, but not too quickly. The first rule is don't kill the host, at least not right away. And up until now, Ebola has sort of gotten this wrong. It used to spark an outbreak somewhere in Central Africa, and it would kill people off so fast that it didn't even get a chance to travel to the big city, to make its big debut on the international stage when people tried to seek medical care. But for Ebola, this meant that it was contained in very remote parts of the world. The other thing you want, if you want to be a highly successful virus, is to make sure that your host is contagious before the host gets very sick. And again, with Ebola, this was not really the case. People were most contagious when they were incredibly sick or they were dead. Also, as an ambitious virus, you want to be with the movers and shakers. You want to be with the jet set. So you don't want to go after the remote villages who might end up dying off in obscurity. You want to go after hosts who happen to fly on airplanes. So while one initial outbreak might be churning away in Equatorial Guinea, the ambitious virus could hop on a plane, end up in Houston, and an obscure disease could become a global pandemic. As humans get exposed to more and more new emerging pathogens, it becomes more and more likely that we're going to run into a pathogen that is this highly ambitious virus that I was just talking about. An organism that transmits easily, that bides its time in its host before making that host sick, and manages to spread all over the world before being stopped. HIV is actually a good example of a highly ambitious virus. Since it was first detected in 1981, HIV has reached every corner of the earth. It's killed roughly 40 million people, and another 35 million are living with it right now. The thing about HIV, however, is it's spread primarily through sexual contact and injection drug use. Imagine if it happened that HIV could have been spread by mosquito bites, or that it could have been airborne. it's not unreasonable from a medical perspective to think that such a virus will at some point confront the human race. Viruses don't discriminate. They simply want to reproduce. And the big question is the world ready for the next HIV, for the next Spanish flu? In 1918, the Spanish flu virus faced huge challenges. It was limited by geography, by distance, by oceans, by impenetrable forests. In the 21st century, those limits have disappeared. In our globalized world, even the remotest part of the planet is now accessible in just a few hours plane ride from bustling megacities, whether it's Sao Paulo, Brazil, or Lagos, Nigeria, Karachi, Jakarta, Paris, or New York. Is the world ready for the next lethal pathogen? I would argue that the recent Ebola outbreak in West Africa shows definitively that we are not. The West African Ebola epidemic was a product of the 21st century. It was a product of a lethal mix of deforestation, poverty, overpopulation, weak public health systems, paired with a fairly decent modern transportation network. The Ebola virus jumped over from bats, and again, my editor's not here, so I can say it was bats, even though no one has completely proven that. But it's quite clear that it came from bats. And it happened in an area where there had been a lot of clear cutting in recent decades. And it also happened in an area, unlike Central Africa, where other Ebola outbreaks have occurred, that are fairly sparsely populated. This was remote parts of West Africa, but there actually were population centers fairly close together. Villages were not that far from one another. And it also had a system of minivan taxis that run over these deeply rutted dirt roads that allowed the Ebola virus to spread quickly throughout the region. Those taxis might not be very comfortable, but they will move you as a virus from one place to another. And within a matter of hours, you can move, dozens of miles, even get all the way eventually to the regional capitals. And that is what happened. My first trip to report on the Ebola outbreak was in July of last year. And to just put you into the time frame of that, this was before Thomas Eric Duncan, the Liberian man, came to the United States and ended up dying in a hospital in Dallas. But he also infected 2 nurses there. And that really threw Ebola onto the national stage. And my trip was in July. That hadn't yet happened. We knew that this was an outbreak that wasn't going away. It was clear from the numbers that this was more serious than any other Ebola outbreak we had ever seen before. And so I got on a plane and I flew to Sierra Leone. And I hired a driver, flew into Freetown, which is in the western side of Sierra Leone. Most drivers did not want to go with me on this trip. It was very hard to find a driver willing to go and to try and find a vehicle to go. So I ended up getting a driver, and we managed to rent a really beat-up Toyota 4Runner, which is kind of like a cross between a pickup and an SUV, but it's got space in the back. And then we drove more than 8 hours, spent the night, and then finally reached what at that point was really the epicenter of the outbreak. It was a place where Doctors Without Borders had set up a field hospital in the town of Kailaun. The local government hospital for this region was on the verge of collapse. Numerous staff had been infected. Many had died, including the lead doctor, including Sierra Leone's top infectious disease doctor had died at that hospital. Nurses were refusing to work. That hospital in Kenema would end up shutting down a few weeks after I left. As nurses refused to work, and it became clear that they couldn't stop Ebola from spreading in the wards. And when I got there, I knew I wanted to get to this hospital that Doctors Without Borders was running, but I had been emailing with one contact from the World Health Organization who I knew was on the ground there. And it turned out he was really one of the only World Health Organization officials that was on the ground. And his name was Paolo, and he was a Spaniard. And white guy with incredibly curly hair that was almost an afro, and tight curls. And at this point, there was great concern that shaving might make you more susceptible to catching Ebola. So all of the male aid workers had stopped shaving. So Paolo had this big head of curly hair, and then he stopped shaving. And I drove into the hotel. It was a hotel compound, a very simple hotel, more like a motel, but it was where Doctors Without Borders had set up shop. And Paolo is there in the courtyard, and he's directing he's got a crew there that he's directing them to move some things around, and he's talking on the phone, and he sees me, and he gets incredibly excited when he sees me drive in with this Toyota 4Runner. And at this point, nobody was shaking hands. Basically, that had become taboo. But Paolo comes over, and he's incredibly excited. And he says, "This is great. We can use your truck." And it turns out that the morgue at this point, which is in a tent at the Ebola hospital, is overflowing with bodies, and Paolo is in charge of disposing of them. But he doesn't have a vehicle. And so I make it immediately clear that we're not putting the corpses into my truck, that's not going to happen. And he's like, no. Okay, so if I could just get my crew into your truck, then we could put all of the bodies into the ambulance, and then we could, because I've got to get I've got to clean out the morgue. And at that moment, this is when I first arrived in what is essentially the hot zone, I could see that the global response to Ebola was completely falling apart. This was the representative of the World Health Organization in what is on the verge of being an international crisis, and he doesn't even have a vehicle so that he can go about burying the dead bodies from the hospital. And in this story, I just always remember it because it feels to me like it illustrates what was so wrong with the global response to this outbreak. The people on the ground didn't have the resources that they needed. The people with Ebola would end up riding in taxis to the hospital because there were no ambulances to pick them up. Public health experts knew at that moment in time what needed to be done to control an outbreak like this. You needed to track down and monitor anyone who'd had close contact with a known Ebola case, and you needed to get any suspected cases into isolation before they could spread the disease further. None of this was happening. Even the isolating of the sick was only happening on a voluntary basis for people who managed to get themselves to a treatment unit. This was 7 months after the outbreak began. It was at a time when health officials knew that this outbreak was out of control, and people on the front lines were left to beg rides from people like me in order to move their burial crews around. So in July of this year, before this had even become a big story, I was finding chaos on the ground. Now, at that point in time, away from the front lines, in Geneva, at the headquarters of the World Health Organization, there was also chaos. The World Health Organization, the WHO, is the world's top health agency. It has a mandate to deal with health crises that cross international boundaries, which this outbreak had been doing for months. Yet, the WHO refused to take charge of the Ebola crisis. WHO officials at this point in July were still insisting that their role was to support the local health ministries in whatever they wanted to do to combat this Ebola problem. But the ministries of health in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia were in no position to mount a counterattack against Ebola. They didn't have the resources, the know-how, or the personnel. Within a matter of weeks, Liberia's public health system completely collapsed, with all the public hospitals and clinics shutting down. Staff were unwilling to go to work because they were terrified they would get infected. Patients were terrified to seek medical treatment because they thought that any hospital they entered was infected with the disease. The main Catholic hospital in Monrovia, Liberia, shut down. Things got so bad that President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia wrote an open letter to the world begging for the outside world to come and save her country. A letter I have never seen before in history of a leader of one nation begging the outside world to save her country. And how did the world respond? Again, I would argue not very well. The UN Security Council decided it would just sidestep the World Health Organization, which is a UN agency. So it basically undermined its own health agency and set up an entirely new Ebola response called UNMIR, the UN Mission for Ebola Emergency Response. And they staffed it with disaster people, a lot of the same people who led the UN response to the Haiti earthquake. And basically they set up a parallel chain of command to try to do some of the same things that the WHO hadn't been doing. The US, for its part, said it was going to focus on just one country, Liberia. France offered to take on the problem in Guinea, and the British said they would deal with Sierra Leone. Well, again, this was incredibly strange as an approach to deal with what was clearly a regional pandemic that was not respecting any international borders. President Obama took the incredibly unusual step of ordering US troops to Liberia to build Ebola hospitals. Unfortunately, it took them so long to build the tented field hospitals that the outbreak essentially had peaked before any of them even opened. Ultimately, what broke the back of the outbreak was behavior change. People in the region came to understand how Ebola spreads, and they stopped touching anyone who was sick, even loved ones who were dying. Ebola is scary on many levels, but it's also scary in what it showed about the readiness of our world to deal with an emerging disease outbreak. This Ebola epidemic killed roughly 11,000 people. The Spanish flu, as I said, killed 50 million. If you look at the history of disease outbreaks, it's obvious that we will face other pandemics, other outbreaks that are far worse than even this terrifying last Ebola crisis. And all the global trends around deforestation, overpopulation, the increased flow of shipping containers and plane loads of people back and forth across the earth, all of these trends make it more likely that new viruses will jump over from animals to humans. And these trends all increase the risk of new, potentially lethal diseases spreading around the globe. If we overlook this issue, if we fail to prepare for future global pandemics, we overlook it at our peril.